taped, which means that during the Q&A, we're going to have to make sure that I get to you with a microphone so we can hear, so we pick up the audio for the taping. So if you just raise your hand and just wait till I get to you to ask your question, that would be really great. Thank you so much, and welcome, Margot.
I actually have to start with an apology because I changed the title after I submitted it for the brochure, so the new title is here. It's Fulfilling the Revolution, Memory and Abolitionism in 1850's Boston. So I have to apologize to anyone who came as an acolyte of John Tyler. I'm not going to talk about him, but you probably wouldn't like what I had to say about him anyway. And instead I'm going to talk about the 1850s, largely because the pictures are a little bit more engaging. And on that note, I want to start with an illustration from 1851 that depicts a crowd listening to an abolitionist speaker on Boston Common. And there are a couple of striking things about this image. First is that the audience is what people in the 19th century would have called a promiscuous crowd. There are men and women present, as well as blacks and whites, adults and children. And this is a good representation both of the diversity of the constituency and leadership of the 19th century anti-slavery movement, as well as its more radical side, which had an emphasis on social equality. And the person speaking here is Wendell Phillips, a Boston lawyer and talented orator. Is there a lot of feedback on this? Can you hear okay? Okay. Phillips was a white man, but it's worth noting that the abolitionist movement opened up some of the first opportunities in American history for African Americans and especially for women to speak in public. So it was possible in the mid-19th century, though still controversial, to attend a mixed gathering like this and see a person of color or a woman standing in the central position as Phillips is here. When I look at this illustration, though, the person who most attracts my attention is not Phillips at the center, but this man at the bottom, who is the only one looking out at us, the viewers. And he's holding up a piece of paper that says, Cradle of Liberty. Above the words, there's a drawing of a building, and I don't know if you can recognize it, but it's Fanueil Hall, which was, of course, the site of some of the most significant patriot orations and gatherings of the Revolutionary era. So what's going on here? Clearly, this man in the foreground is asking us to make some kind of connection between the anti-slavery discussion that's taking place in this scene and Boston's revolutionary heritage as the cradle of liberty. And what's fascinating to me is that when you read abolitionist speeches and newspapers or look at abolitionist iconography, you see stuff like this all the time. Abolitionists were constantly making reference to the American Revolution. And to understand why, you have to recognize that many Northerners in the mid-19th century were unhappy with the persistence of slavery in the South. But many of their reasons had little to do with humanitarian ideals. Instead, there was a widespread sense that slavery gave the South disproportionate economic and political power in the nation at large. But the number of people who took public and principled stands against slavery like this was comparatively small. These abolitionists were by no means universally beloved by their fellow Northerners. They actually endured a fair amount of name-calling and, in a few notorious cases, violent resistance. So in the North, then, even someone who distrusted the slave power, which is how some Northerners came to refer to the South in the mid-19th century, even someone who deeply disliked and feared the South's influence on the national agenda might have believed that abolitionists were dangerous radicals on the other extreme. And here in Boston, abolitionists did put forward some very radical ideas, not only against slavery, but in favor of equality across lines of race and gender. These abolitionists were deeply critical of the fundamental institutions that comprised their social world, the family, the state, and the church, and they believed that they were living in a moment that demanded tremendous, really apocalyptic change. So with these ideas that were quite extreme and a public that was largely skeptical and even openly hostile towards them, how could they make their point of view more amenable? Well, One strategy, which you see here, was to look backward and draw parallels between their situation and another moment of dramatic historical change. And the obvious precedent, especially for abolitionists in Boston, was, of course, the American Revolution. And it was especially convenient that starting around the 1820s, with the 50th anniversary of the Revolution, Bostonians had quite a bit of enthusiasm for commemorating that period. In the 1820s, for example, they published many memoirs of soldiers at a moment when the last generation of survivors of the Revolution was dying off. They organized commemorative parades and celebrations, and they began building monuments like the one on Bunker Hill. And the Bunker Hill Monument was kind of the big dig of the 19th century in that it took 18 years and far more money than anyone anticipated to complete. So, to some extent, the Revolutionary era was to mid-19th century Americans what World War II is represented for us today as the greatest generation or the good war. Many 19th century Americans worried that they weren't living up to the patriotic standard of courage, self-sacrifice, and idealism that the American revolutionaries had shown. So the best they could do, they decided, was to make sure that their contemporaries properly honored the heroism of their predecessors. And Edward Everett, who was a Massachusetts politician and one of the masterminds of the Bunker Hill Monument, put it this way. It is the order of nature that the generation to achieve nobly should be succeeded by the generation worthily to record and gratefully to commemorate. Now, to this idea, many abolitionists would have said, no, that's not quite it. Now, it's rather difficult to talk about abolitionist ideology as a singular thing because, by and large, they love to disagree with each other. But most anti-slavery folks in the mid-19th century would have acknowledged the significance of the American revolutionaries as a truly great generation. But they believed that the revolutionary patriots had initiated a transformation in the 1770s that was as yet in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s still unfinished. So they wanted the present generation to step forward in a new struggle for liberation, without which the sacrifices of the revolutionaries would be rendered meaningless. And the rather schematic way that I like to sketch out this difference in historical memory is to say that it was a question of movements or monuments. Abolitionists found the 19th century's complacent commemoration of the American Revolution, including the erection of a monument on Bunker Hill and the accompanying celebratory talk about American freedom, hypocritical in light of the persistence of slavery in American society. So rather than rest on the idea that the greatest moment in American history was behind them, they organized a movement that would fulfill what the American revolutionaries had left undone. And this historical perspective is quite clear in an abolitionist editorial criticizing the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument in 1843. And this anonymous author wrote, "Another struggle, mightier than of old, for the emancipation of 3 millions of people from servile chains is going on in the land. It is a struggle to secure to all the full enjoyment of those rights which the patriots of 1776 fought and bled in vain to establish." So that's kind of the general overview of abolitionist historical memory of the American Revolution. What I want to do now is look closely at sources from the mid-19th century that illustrate one particular aspect of this abolitionist effort to claim a revolutionary legacy. But before we get deep into the 1850s, I want to look at the revolutionary period itself to set up a kind of contrast. So I have two images from the Revolution that will probably be familiar to the Revolutionary War buffs among you. And the first of these is Paul Revere's engraving of what came to be known as the Boston Massacre. And this illustration was created and published just a few weeks after the famous events of March 5th, 1770. The second image is the American artist John Trumbull's painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Trumbull began this canvas in 1785, 10 years after the battle. He completed it the following year, 1786. Now, before I talk about these individually, there are three things I want to say about the two of them. First is something that these images have in common with each other and with virtually any other historical source. And that is that they do not straightforwardly document what happened on March 5th, 1770 or June 17th, 1775. Instead, they reflect the biases and priorities of the people who created them and the historical moment that produced them. And in fact, as I'll try to describe more in a minute, these images contributed to debates that were going on when Revere and Trumbull created them. Debates about, say, the necessity of political resistance in the early stages of the revolution or the desirability of social hierarchy in its aftermath. But more about that in a second. The second commonality is the obvious one. There's some overlap in subject matter here. Both of these images represent significant incidents of revolutionary violence that occurred in the Boston area. And third, a more subtle commonality in terms of what's depicted. Both of these events, the Boston Massacre and the Battle of Bunker Hill, were revolutionary incidents in which people of color are known to have had a significant presence. So although it may not appear to be so, these are in fact two of the most frequently reproduced images of people of color from the revolutionary period. Well, let's look more closely at the Revere engraving. As many scholars of the Revolution have noted, this image is one of the most powerful pieces of political propaganda to emerge from the American Revolution. And what was angering Revere and other Bostonians in early 1770 was the continuing presence of British troops who had been occupying the city since 1768, when there had been large-scale colonial resistance against British taxation. And I won't go into the details of the so-called Boston Massacre today, but the important thing to know is that the long simmering tension between civilians and British soldiers reached a head on March 5th, 1770, when a fight broke out on King Street, or what is now State Street, just around the corner. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 civilian men were dead, presumably shot by the British, and another would die of his wounds days later. And there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly happened during the fight, but it was clearly a chaotic scene. And it's also clear that at least some of the civilians were armed with sticks and clubs. The chaos and the violence on both sides were not what Revere emphasized in this scene, however. Instead, he depicted a neat line of British regulars with their guns pointed directly into this crowd of civilians who seem hardly to have the means of defending themselves. So it's a straightforward picture of a massacre with obvious villains and victims. And this was a powerful image in the early stages of the Revolution, when the Patriots wanted to rally people against the British and against standing armies. What Revere did not emphasize was that the people involved on the American side of this fray would not necessarily have been considered respectable Bostonians in any other context. In fact, the first person to die, Crispus Attucks, was a runaway slave from Framingham who was probably of both African and native ancestry. And in some versions of this print, one of the faces of the victims is colored in a darker brown. But I've read a couple of different art historical interpretations of this image that identify different figures in it as Attucks. So I think the important point to make is that Revere chose not to call attention to the fact that one of the victims of the Boston Massacre was a man of color. Trumbull's painting also served a political purpose, but his was best suited to the aftermath of the Revolution. Now, the Battle of Bunker Hill was one of the earliest military engagements of the Revolutionary War on June 17, 1775, and it was a military defeat but a moral victory for the Americans, who proved that they could hold their own against a much larger and more experienced British force. Like Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, Trumbull's painting depicts an episode of violence between the Americans and the British, but Trumbull does not emphasize the conflict between the colonists and the Crown. In fact, the title he gave to the painting was not The Battle of Bunker Hill, but The Death of General Warren. And Joseph Warren was a well-respected doctor and the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. When he was shot at Bunker Hill, he became the first American patriot of his rank and prominence to be killed in the war with Britain, which turned him into kind of an instant martyr. 10 years later, then, when Trumbull began to put the Battle of Bunker Hill on canvas, he made Warren's heroic death the central scene. So here he is, dressed in white and bathed in light. But Warren isn't the only hero here. Notice this British officer stepping forward to stop one of his men from bayoneting Warren. Honoring the patriotism of those who fought in the American Revolution is certainly a part of this painting, but it's also about celebrating the maintenance of social hierarchies. The heroes of the painting are military officers, regardless of which side they're on. What makes the lower-ranking men worthy of commemoration is their allegiance to their officers, like these two who are protecting the languishing Warren. And there's another example of social deference at the far right of the canvas, over here. And Trumbull described this pair as a young American wounded in the sword hand, attended by a faithful Negro. Now, we know that dozens of men of color fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Some 19th and 20th century viewers of this painting have claimed that the man pictured here was one of those black soldiers, Peter Salem, who was said to have played a heroic role in the battle. And I'll say more about Peter Salem later. But what's important to note for now is that Trumbull did not make an effort to distinguish this black man as an individual, either in writing or in the painting. He's simply called a faithful Negro who in the painting is largely hidden behind his master, whose gun he is presumably carrying. So we've seen two images of the participation of men of color in the Revolution from the beginning and the end of the Revolutionary period, 1770 and 1786. I want now to make a huge leap forward in time to the middle of the 19th century and the height of the national controversy over slavery. So contrast, again, Paul Revere's image of the Boston Massacre from 1770 with another print of the same scene, this one from the mid-1850s. So Crispus Attucks has now taken center stage. He's right in the middle, he's clearly a man of color, and he's fighting back. So what's going on here? Well, at every moment in history, people make choices about which parts of the past they want to remember and commemorate. During the years of the Revolutionary War, Bostonians did commemorate the Boston Massacre with annual speeches and official observances, some of which I believe took place here in the Old South Meeting House. After the war was over, however, they stopped celebrating it. It was no longer very useful to have speeches railing against the dangers of standing armies when the British had pulled out and the Americans didn't have much of an army of their own. Furthermore, from the perspective of the elite men who served on the Boston Town Council, the Boston Massacre was a rather dangerous event to commemorate. Many people in the early Republic bought into John Adams' famous description of the massacre as a riot instigated by a crowd of outsiders, or as Adams put it, a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jack Tars. In the 1780s, then, the image of Crispus Attucks as a rabble-rouser didn't seem like a very good hero at a moment when elite Bostonians were trying to secure the social order in the wake of the upheavals of war. So instead, patriot elites encouraged people to remember safer events, like the Battle of Bunker Hill. And compared to the mob violence of the Boston Massacre, remembering Bunker Hill was safe because the patriots who resisted the British at Bunker Hill did so as an organized army under a set of officers. Moreover, the martyr of Bunker Hill, General Joseph Warren, was a much more unambiguous hero than Crispus Attucks. He was a military officer with mainstream political and social authority. So, by the 19th century, Trumbull's painting of Warren's heroic death at Bunker Hill had become one of the most familiar images of the Revolutionary War, and Crispus Attucks had become largely forgotten. But that changed after 1850. And no one was more important in reviving the name of Crispus Attucks than this man, William Cooper Nell. Nell was a prolific writer and activist whose political agenda included abolitionism, racial integration, and women's rights. He spent most of his life in Boston, where he worked closely with the white abolitionist leader William Lloyd Garrison and contributed frequently to Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Nell can also be considered one of the earliest African-American historians. In the early 1850s, he began to publish his research on black participation in the American Revolution, which culminated in 1855 with this book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which was essentially a compendium of every available piece of information about African-American involvement on the patriot side of the Revolution. And Crispus Attucks figures prominently in this book, both in the text and in this illustration at the front, which labeled Attucks as the first martyr of the American Revolution. And in fact, I think the artist here was consciously revising Trumbull's painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. If you compare the two images, in both central scenes you have the reclining figure of the dying man, supported by two of his compatriots, forming this kind of triangular shape. And then you have the tricon hat and the sword or stick on the ground next to them. Given that Trumbull's painting was widely familiar by this time and that Joseph Warren was the iconic revolutionary martyr, I think it's no coincidence that this scene depicts Attucks' death in this way. In this artist's view, as in Nell's view, the black man is replacing the white man as the first martyr of the Revolution. And of course, remember that the Boston Massacre happened 5 years before the Battle of Bunker Hill. So Nell restored the Boston Massacre and Crispus Attucks to historical significance. But he also added black men and a few women to the stories that were already being told about the Revolution, including the Battle of Bunker Hill. Nell's section on Bunker Hill has this illustration. We know that before the war, Peter Salem, the soldier pictured here, was a slave in Framingham. He enlisted in April of 1775. We don't know much more about his service, but 50 years later, an anecdote began to appear in print about a Negro soldier shooting and killing a British officer, Major Pitcairn, at Bunker Hill. And there are different accounts as to which of the many black soldiers was the one to do this, but a number of sources, including Nell's Colored Patriots and a lot of sources that you still read today, credit it to Peter Salem. So here is Peter Salem, and here is Pitcairn dying. And this scene is another revision of John Trumbull's canvas of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here, the artist, there's the painting. The artist has replaced Trumbull's pairing of the white lieutenant and his faithful Negro with the single figure of Peter Salem, who is not carrying a weapon for anyone but himself. So through this depiction of the black man as a citizen soldier, 19th century abolitionists took inspiration from John Trumbull's 18th century painting in a way that was quite different from what Trumbull had intended. Now, a question that you might ask is, which image is a more accurate depiction of what happened at Bunker Hill? And I'd suggest that we might get farther if we shelve that question and ask another one. We know that officers brought their servants with them to war, which seems to be what Trumbull thought he was showing here. We also know that black men fought independently and with great skill and courage. So in that sense, Nell and his illustrator were providing an important corrective to Trumbull's scene. But the pairing of these two images tells us less about the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775 than it does about changing social and political ideals between 1785 and 1855, when these two images were produced. And we can credit this growing interest in giving African Americans a central place in historical memory to the rise of abolitionist sentiment in the 19th century. But even more specifically, this kind of representation of black participation in the Revolutionary War became much more prevalent after 1850. And it's no coincidence that it's also after 1850 that abolitionism, which had been a fairly small but strong movement since 1830, after 1850 it takes on a much more militant stance. And the real turning point here is the Compromise of 1850, which was an agreement between Northern legislators and their Southern counterparts that, among other things, passed an expansive Fugitive Slave Act. That law denied suspected runaway slaves captured in the North the right to jury trials, and it required ordinary citizens to aid slave catchers in pursuing fugitives. So abolitionists saw the compromise as an absolute betrayal of Northern principles of freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 created a crisis environment for blacks in the North. In the 3 months after the act passed, about 3,000 blacks already living in the North fled to Canada out of the reach of slave hunters. Many others resolved to stay put and defend their claims to American citizenship. So in Boston, it was in the early 1850s that black men mounted a challenge to the Massachusetts law that allowed only white men to serve in militias. And one of the leaders of this effort was one of the first black men to practice law in Boston, Robert Morris. He made a speech before the state legislature's Committee on Militias in 1853 in which he insisted that the right to form militias was something that the state owed to black men. And he said, made an explicit parallel to the American Revolution. During the entire revolutionary struggle, our fathers fought side by side with your fathers all over the country. And at the termination of that prolonged and severe contest, our fathers who had so bravely fought in the defense of American liberty were immediately reduced to slavery. After this lapse of time, we, their descendants, expect remuneration from your hands. We ask that a part of the old debt due from this country to our fathers be now paid to us. And this statement might sound strange to us today because modern political discourse tends to construct military service as something that ordinary people owe to the country, not something that the country owes to the people. But the whole idea behind the militia system is that local and national defense are best carried out by citizens, those people who have a stake in the republic, and so it will keep the military from skewing the balance between power and liberty. So for Morris, to be included in the militia was to be recognized as a citizen. And this is a really important point. The terms that we often use to talk about the status of African Americans in the early republic, the period between the Revolution and the Civil War, are slave and free. But as one historian has written, freedom by itself is an empty category. It's a term that connotes a lack of constraint rather than the presence of anything. So a major problem for blacks in the North, as well as for those in places in the South where there were substantial populations of freed people, was not just, are we free, but are we citizens? So did free blacks have the rights of citizens, rights that the state was bound to respect? Well, the laws were equivocal on this point. For instance, in some northern states, the rights of black men to vote were actually taken away in the 19th century. So we're not talking here about a progressive narrative of increasing rights over time. Massachusetts was one of the few states in which, at least on paper, free black men always had the right to vote, even though they were still excluded from militia service. William Cooper Nell argued that so long as the Massachusetts militia law had the word white in it, black men lacked full, in his words, manhood and citizenship. And if it wasn't already obvious from the dearth of female faces and voices in this talk, Nell's phrase makes it clear that memories of the American Revolution in this period were heavily gendered. And it's important to understand this language and these arguments in the context of racial thought of the period. There was a tendency on the part of whites, including abolitionist whites, to both infantilize and feminize slaves, and by extension, all blacks. And the classic example of this kind of feminization is the character Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe's response to the Fugitive Slave Act. Tom is a good Christian at a time when piety and femininity were closely linked. He displays an almost motherly love for little Eva, his master's daughter, and you see that here. And most importantly, he never forcibly resists slavery. At the end of the novel, he becomes a martyr not through violent resistance in the mode of Crispus Attucks, but by showing Christian compassion for his master, even as his master is beating him to death. And this characterization of enslaved men as displaying many of the traits associated with women of the time made black men more sympathetic and less threatening for white audiences. So the feminization of black men could be part of an effective anti-slavery campaign. However, at a time when voting and other privileges of citizenship were limited to men, the feminization of slaves couldn't offer blacks more than second-class status once they were free. So the publication of The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, the depiction of an armed black man standing by himself in the revised image of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the renewed interest in Crispus Attucks as the first martyr of the Revolution, these were all part of a dual strategy to argue against slavery and for the recognition of black men as citizens. A citizen is someone who is able to assert his own rights and fight for them when they are threatened. And with their references to black men fighting in the Revolution, Nell and Morris were saying, black men know how to play the role of the citizen, we have done it in the past, and we ought to be recognized for it now. So in the 1850s, when the freedoms of blacks in the North were so threatened, because they were always vulnerable to the slave catchers if they couldn't prove they were free, at this moment it was all the more important that black men be able to carry out the citizen's right and obligation of self-defense. And by emphasizing how blacks participated in the revolution, this argument made it clear that the revolutionary legacy belonged both to blacks and whites, so citizenship belonged to blacks and whites as well. Of course, as you probably know, the Supreme Court did not agree with this assessment of the history. In 1857, the court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford found that for the previous century, blacks in America had, as they wrote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And thus the decision that blacks were not citizens. A year to the day after this decision came out, March 5th, 1858, William Cooper Nell organized the first of a series of annual commemorations of the Boston Massacre. And here's an advertisement for it. It didn't scan very well, but what I love about this image is that it so overtly links memory and politics. On the one hand, this was a commemorative festival taking place in Old Fanueil Hall. On the other, it's a protest against the Dred Scott decision. And what links these two, the muddled picture in the middle, is this interpretation of Crispus Attucks as a revolutionary martyr. He's falling back into the arms of his compatriots here, who's proving that men of color could act as freedom-loving citizens. And this mixing of history and politics was everywhere at the March 5th, 1858 event. Leading abolitionists gave speeches. There was a display of artifacts from the Revolutionary era. A chorus called the Addicts Glee Club sang a song called Colored American Heroes of 1776. And in his speech, William Lloyd Garrison declared, "Judge Tawney, therefore, stands convicted of grossly falsifying history and for a most wicked and inhuman purpose." Now, Tawney wasn't actually wrong in saying that for most of American history, black men and women had been denied social and political rights. But Nell, Garrison, and other abolitionists were trying first to say that that wasn't the whole story, that there were historical examples of black heroism as well as victimization and subordination. And second, and I think almost more importantly, they were questioning what to do with history. Rather than looking to the past as a fixed model of what should be done in the present, they looked to history to find examples of the possibility of change and fulfillment. And I have more examples, but I think I'll stop there for a question.
Okay, if you could just let me know if you have a question, and I'll be glad to bring the microphone over so we can...
Did this historic memory of Bunker Hill and the death of General Warren, did it have much influence in other parts of the North outside of Boston, like in New York or Philadelphia, or was it confined to this area because the events are in this area?
I see Judy laughing. Okay. It was certainly quite strong in Boston and New England as it is today, but one of the reasons that my dissertation focuses on the Boston area and that a lot of people interested in historical memory focus on the Boston area is that New England is rather hegemonic in its production of historical material. So depending on when, you might find that you learn a lot more about New England than other parts of the country when you study history. And that's a process that began, well, even before the 19th century. But in the 19th century, New England was very active in producing these kind of historical myths. So people would certainly be aware of them in other parts of the country as well.
I think you've drawn a very interesting discussion or comments about the relevance of the revolution in the actions of the 1850s in Boston and perhaps elsewhere in the North. But it is equally true that in the South during the 50s, they were also turning to the revolution for justification of many of the positions that they took. Have you attempted to compare or analyze some of that? I don't want to use the word misuse, but competitive uses of the American Revolution.
Right. My research specifically doesn't deal with the South, but I think that's one of the reasons why these memories of the American Revolution are so interesting, because almost everyone tried to claim the revolution for themselves. I mean, even within Boston, not everyone would buy into the abolitionist narrative of the revolution. And I think what's particularly interesting to me about this period of the 1850s, and particularly unique to not exclusively black abolitionists, but largely black abolitionists, is this effort to call attention to the participation of African American people in the revolution. But you're absolutely right that the Southerners tried to claim the revolution for their own purposes as well.
As someone who's studied history a little bit here in Boston, I have a question. I saw that you brought up the Peter Salem issue in the painting because, of course, he's there. But I'm wondering why people did not pick up on the Salem Poor story. I don't know if you're familiar with him and his role at Bunker Hill, because in my mind he's such a big hero. And, you know, where he received that petition shortly after the battle and such. Why wasn't that ever picked up on, either at that time perhaps, later on in 1840s or so?
Salem Poor is another black soldier who fought at Bunker Hill, and he's distinguished because soon after the war he others who fought at Bunker Hill submit a petition to the Massachusetts legislature to get some sort of reward, which seems to be monetary on his behalf. The legislature did not do anything about it. In the 1820s, which is when the stories about a black man shooting Pitcairn first emerged, I think, in writing, right? People were perhaps talking about these things in the 50-year period in between. Some of the sources are not really clear on who shot him. So some just say Salem, and people have often conflated Peter Salem and Salem-Poor. I would have to go back and check. I don't remember when Salem-Poor gets rediscovered, if you will, in print. But it's a really interesting story.
Anyone else? Maybe I should know, but the last thing that you said where they're now deciding what to do with history, was that new?
The question of what do we make of history?
Where you said, we decide what to do with history rather than look at the facts. Was that a new thing in the 1850s?
Well, the question of whether history is a matter of looking at the facts or interpreting something is a persistent question that historians are still debating. I mean, I think we would all say that history is a matter of interpretation at a critical level. I think this particular abolitionist slant on it is something that's particularly important at this moment.
Are there any other questions? Well, I think we want to thank Margot very much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation and wish her well in her pursuit of her PhD.